Ladies and gentlemen, I am Tosh Berman. This is Tosh Talks. Not a new location here, but I have done shows here, and what here is my office, my writing office. This is here where I wrote pretty much my new memoir, Tosh, as well as working on my future books, Tosh 2, and then I'm even planning ahead with another book of mine called Tosh 3. That will be coming out sometime in the 21st century. The other, 2 and 3. One is coming out next year. But we're not here talking about me. Well, it's all about me because it is Tosh Talks. But I want to talk about Chris Stamey. Chris Stamey is a musician, performer, and a songwriter. And he wrote a book called A Spy in the House of Loud, New York Songs and Stories, published by the University of Texas Press. And first I'll give you a little history, of course. No subject matter is simple to me. It's always complex. Something like Rashomon or Seven Samurai's epic story of sorts. Sometime in 1976, 77, I was buying a lot of punk rock records. And punk rock to me really just means independent music made and produced by independent labels in those years. And there were not many, but there were selective record stores that featured these independent records from Los Angeles, the local music scene in Los Angeles, as well as the music scene in San Francisco, as well as in Michigan, the state of Michigan, and of course, New York City. And I was totally in tune to New York City at the time because I found that culture totally fascinating. And when I went to a record store called Bomp, B-O-M-P Records, Bomp Records, which is also a label run by Greg Shaw, the late Greg Shaw, I came upon a record called The Sneakers. This is a 10-inch record. When I purchased this record, it was a 7-inch record, and it had 6 songs on it. You played it 3 1/3. Sound quality was very muffled, very dense, and totally brilliant. And most of the songs by The Sneakers are written by, most of the songs performed by The Sneakers was written by one of its musicians, Chris Stamey, our subject matter of today. And when I first heard the Sneakers record, it had such a profound effect on me at the time, and it still does. It's still a perfect record to me in many ways. It's this really nervy pop music, really great melodies, but very dense, and it fits in the 1976-77 mode in that it was a time for adventure, time for exploration, time to get out of your straitjacket and experience new things. And the Sneakers from North Carolina, and I believe recorded in North Carolina, including the musicians being from North Carolina, is a really sublime, beautiful statement of a record. And so I noticed the name Chris Stamey, so I kept that in my memory, And then I used to read a magazine, or a newspaper actually, called New York Rocker. And New York Rocker was almost tailor-made for my taste at the time. It focused on New York punk rock and all its musicians, including a little bit of the new wave stuff, but also a lot of the no wave musicians like the Contortions and Lydia Lunch and DNA and Mars and those type of bands as well. So it's a great world to me. You had the New York Dolls, who at the time in '77 were sort of like our early version of New York punk. And, then you have, of course, the Heartbreakers, Johnny Thunders band, but also, Blondie, Television, Richard Hell, CBGB's World, all that, all contained in this one publication. And I remember they had an interview or article on Alex Chilton. And Alex Chilton, who I've talked about numerous times, both in my blog as well as on my show, this show, Tosh Talks, Alex Chilton is a Memphis musician who was in the Box Tops and had a very influential band afterwards called Big Star. Anyway, Big Star broke up. Alex Chilton ended up in New York for a little bit. And one of the people he hooked up with in New York was Chris Stamey. After the Sneakers broke up, or soon after the Sneakers disappeared for a while, they came back, disappeared. Chris Stamey moved to New York to do work as a musician and do recordings, but still in a very much of an underground music sense. And Chris Stamey and Alex Chilton met. I'm not sure how they met. It might be through Terry Ork of Ork Records, who I also done a show on Ork Records. And so anyway, Chris Stamey helped work with Alex Chilton on doing a couple singles for Ork Records or other independent labels at the time. Alex Chilton's world was very chaotic and very not straightforward. It didn't go A to B to C. It went to A to Q, back to B, to all the way to Z, because that's the type of artist he was. And Chris Stamey, in a milder form, is that type of artist as well. And what's interesting about Chris Stamey is that he reminds me of very much, a lot of people were very straitjacketed. Even though they were still making independent music, they were in their own formats. What's so interesting about Chris Stamey, when you hear his music, as the Sneakers, as well as in the band, the DBs, which he was part of, and probably for the average listener, if there's such a thing as the average listener, probably heard of the DBs more than even Chris Stamey or maybe even Alex Chilton at this point. The DBs did have commercial success in the 80s. But nevertheless, what's interesting about Chris Stamey, whatever he's part of, he's basically a hardcore pop songwriter, but with experimental and avant-garde edges to it. Not totally overly avant-garde, still very pop-orientated or rock and roll-orientated, but there are these experimental, minimal, Terry Riley even touches in his music that comes up in his better recordings. And if I was to compare Chris Stamey to somebody, I would actually compare him to John Lennon, like early solo Yoko Ono, John Lennon, Plastic Ono band, where John Lennon wrote pretty much the early years. I'm talking like Cold Turkey, Instant Karma, that era of John Lennon, not really even Imagine, not Imagine, but the early John Lennon solo as well as the later Beatles John Lennon. And Chris Stamey's work does remind me of Lennon's in a sense that there's actually a lot of noise involved in the music. It's never like just a pretty melody. And Chris Stamey writes beautiful melodies as well as John Lennon did. But Chris Stamey always adds like a rough edge to it, like a noise aspect to it. It's not just a pretty melody by itself. There's something else happening. It's sort of like you're like a master chef and you have something really tastes beautiful, just tastes like perfect, but you want to give it a rough edge, make it earthy somehow. And that's what Chris Stamey does with his music. And my favorite, Chris Stamey has released numerous records, solo albums, as well as with other people. And as I showed you, this is like my favorite records of his right now. And one is called Instant, which is really an EP by Chris Stamey. Here's a picture of Chris on the guitar looking kind of like college looking, like I like that clean look, that clean cut look. Haircut, very good. And then Chris Stamey, which I think is his masterpiece, it's a Wonderful Life. And this album I would recommend for you to approach first, because it's the most out there of his work, because it shows his experimental stage, but it also has gorgeous, beautiful melodies, and yet it's still on an experimental stage as well. It's a fantastic record. So Chris Stamey has this recently written and put out a book, A Spy in the House of Loud, which is a great title because, as I mentioned about the experimental stage of Chris Stamey, he acknowledges that aspect in his work by the title, A Spy in the House of Loud. Noise, but maybe under the identity of a pop songwriter. He's doing a little bit more than that, I feel. And this book covers Chris Stamey's years with the Sneakers up to now. But most of the book is really dealing with New York in the 1970s. And it was a small world then. CBGB was a very small world. Everybody knew each other. Everybody, heard each other, everybody saw each other's bands at places like CBGB's, Max's Kansas City. And it was just a really lively period of time and place where a lot of great artists like Chris Stamey could do their art and music. And this including films and art, visual art as well. And in a way, Orc Records, which I talked about in a previous show, was sort of like one of the anchors of the New York scene. They're one of the first New York punk labels. And they had like Richard Hell, when he went solo, when he left Television and Heartbreakers. That's where he made his first solo record, as well as Chris Stamey did records for Orc, but under his own label, I think called Car Records at the time. So Chris Stamey was always thinking ahead and making independent records. He was one of the first do-it-yourself guys in New York as well. And A Spy in the House of Loud serves many purposes. He wrote a really magnificent book. One, he's a good writer, good prose writer. Two, the book has a lot of stories about the personalities you want to know about of that era. You're not going to be disappointed. Three, it's also a musician geek book where he talks about equipment, guitars, recording studios, which probably for the non-musician will find it kind of boring. If you're a musician, you'll probably find it totally fascinating because you want to hear about guitar strings and studios and how certain studios have certain sounds. As a non-musician myself, I found it totally enticing and still inviting to be in that world. I was not bored reading that aspect of the book. Another thing great about the Chris Stamey book is that he also talks about records of that time, not only his own records, of course, but he gives a great deal of time in writing about other records that were happening at that time period in New York. And Chris Stamey, to me, strikes me, I never met him, but he strikes me as a very generous, supporting musician. And the only thing I want to add to that is that he is a supportive player. He is a collaborator. And he does work well with other people. But I think he is one of the geniuses of that time and period, as well as now. He's still a great songwriter. And Chris Stamey doesn't have a huge ego in the book. He's basically there to serve the story and serve his music. But if you read the book, you think, this is a guy who probably writes good pop songs and works with interesting people and has an interesting life. But the fact is, as a listener, when I listen to his albums, I hear genius, I hear brilliance. I think he's one of the great songwriters of the 20th century, actually. I think he's just as good as John Lennon, good as any of the Beatles, good as any pop music made in the 20th century. And Chris Stamey is definitely, for me, up there. And so you might miss that aspect when you're reading this book, because again, Stamey is not super ego. He's basically serving a purpose of his music and his environment. And it's a great musician's memoir. Again, due to the technicality of making music, how to make music, all about getting a gig in nightclubs. I'm sure every striving musician want to read this as like a how-to book in a way, but told through Chris Stamey's sensibility and I think the importance of its time and place. And Stamey was very close friends with a lot of the musicians, including Richard Lloyd, who I talked about and reviewed in a previous Tosh Talk show. And Chris Stamey and Richard Lloyd did work together for Orc Records or for Car Records. And the other book that's a good companion, you should get this book as well. I would also, as I mentioned in my last show, I did a thing on 20th Century Boy on Duncan Hanna. I would recommend all three of these books actually together because it deals with New York City, 1970s. Duncan Hanna was a huge music fan, even though he was a painter. He was in the Warhol scene a bit, and he was also in the music scene a lot, as well as being a visual painter. So you have Richard Lloyd of television and doing solo work after television, and Donna Hanna, and then you have the Chris Stamey book, and you have a really great picture of New York at the time. Saying that, I know there are many, many books right now about New York rock or New York punk, and including The Great Please Kill Me, which is a classic, and you must read, must study. But it's interesting that this music is still current and still lively and it still means a lot as you listen to it now. When I listen to the music of that period, I don't go back to the 70s and think those are the good old days. That music still talks to me in a very contemporary, livid way. And Chris Stamey's music, as well as Television and other bands of that era, are rarely dated to me. They're still contemporary works of art that still speaks to me now in 2018. If you're watching this in 2019 or 2020, I would say even then, speaking to you in the future. So I strongly recommend you get the Chris Stamey's book, A Spy in the House Aloud, published by the University of Texas Press. And also do locate the Chris Stamey records. You know, you can find it used. Well, they're pretty much not in print anymore, but they do put the Sneakers EP in and out of print, and you can find it online. And definitely on YouTube, you probably can hear some of Chris Stamey's music, as well as YouTube, Apple Music and Spotify and stuff like that. But Chris Stamey is really the real deal, and he's totally underrated and a total marvelous songwriter, performer, and I think a brilliant artist. This is Tosh Berman. This is Tosh Talks, and I will see you in the very near future. Bye-bye.